Hey everybody, we are teaching tilt brush, and this time we're going to paint a fish. Yeah, we're actually going to paint something this time. We're going to bring together some of the techniques, tools, and tips that we talk about in other videos to actually paint something this time. So I've given myself a nice underwater background. You could start with an empty background, however you like. Now, what kind of fish are you going to paint? we're not going to call it cartoon. We're going to call it stylized, a much more polite term to mean I'm just going to make a fish, not a particular kind of fish, but it will be recognizable immediately as a fish. As opposed to abstract, you could have a pineapple digging a hole and call it fish, and that counts. Or realistic, where I'm trying to make a specific kind of fish. I'm just going for the general concept of fish, a platonic ideal. If you're doing a realistic fish, you could bring in your reference images. That way you can make sure you got color patterns and light right, that type of thing. Since I'm just making this sort of slightly stylized fish here, I'm not going to worry about getting into too much detail. Now, because I want to make my fish a lot of elements the same on both sides, both to save painting and to save time, I'm going to activate my mirror here. Here's my mirror, and I'm going to get it set up so I can paint my fish, and most of the things are going to be the same on both sides. Scales, fins, that type of thing. So we'll see how this is going to work. To get started, ideally you should have some idea ahead of time of what kind of fish you want to make. So I'm doing sort of the generic koi goldfish type of thing, but a little more stylized using some of our tools and tricks. So I'm going to start with a generic fish form, and I'm going to use a hull brush in a nice dark fish color. Size almost doesn't matter because I'm not going for the detail. This is just the general form. You can see my mirror tool kicking in here. So I'm just going to give it a general fishy shape. Let's try it a little better than that. Keep it close to the rail for now. A general fishy shape that bulges in the middle a little bit. Okay. So if we look around that, we have that sort of fishy torpedo shape here. Okay. Right along the center line. Now you could do it freehand without the mirror. It might not be perfectly centered. If you have trouble with that mirror, try making it a different size. Either make yourself big so you can do a smaller gesture, or make yourself really small so you can control exactly the flow a little bit better. There's no one way you have to do this. That's part of this demonstration. Okay, so now I've got my fish in place. Now I could have done this with the lit hull. One of the shaded hulls, the matte hull, for example, or the shiny hull. That would be affected by the lighting in the same way the rest of the place could be. If I was to do that, let's do that a little bit bigger just so you can see what the heck Ben is talking about. You can see how the shadows come into play more. It's a little harder to control because any mistake is immediately visible. This hull, same with the shiny hull, any of those seams become quickly apparent, and you can spend a lot of time getting it as smooth as you can. In my case, I'm going to cover it with scales anyway. I also want to make it one I can move around, so I'm not too worried about light source as far as my generic fish here goes. So in my case, stylized, I'm going the more cartoony tools, the unlit tools. A realistic fish, you'll go more for the lit tools. So now that I've got my generic fish in place, some of the fins are going to be the same on both sides. So I'm going to leave the mirror up to do the horizontal fins, and I'm going to find a nice flat shape. Whether or not you use the shade is up to you, again. So you'll notice this one end is thick and one end is pointy. I'm going to try to use that. That's a little too big. Again, feel free to use your sizes and stuff. There we go. You can see with a mirror shape, I've got a fin on both sides here. Where'd my fishies go? So I've got my fish on both sides here, but the tail and back, I probably don't want duplicated. So I'm just going to temporarily turn off the mirror. There we go. So now I've got some fins on the fish. They don't need to be duplicated. They're centerline fins. Back to the mirror. Okay. Now if I'm going to do scales on this guy, depending on the tool you use will be affected by the light source or not. In my case, I'm going for the stylized. I want to make these scales sharply outlined. So the cell vinyl is the one that gives me those outlines. Since it's cartoony, I'm actually going to use the color of the scales to give me the light and dark. So if this is my main orange, this should actually be sort of the shadow color, what's behind the scales. So down here underneath is where I'm going to be doing this particular scale. Think about the direction, think about the overlap. Let's get the size down a little bit. Now you don't have to be perfect unless you're going for that photorealism. I'm not, so I'm just going to get the whole bunch of scales about the same size and about the same direction. And we may even time lapse. Okay, so that's the rough scales. You can see how we're using color for the light and shadow. A little bit of actual shadow. Okay. Now what's interesting is only color is for the light and shadow on the fish. It's all using the tune, so if we change the lighting, it won't affect the fish. Now that we've got that, let's add a few embellishments here. So I'm going to get that darker color, but of a simple non-colored, so we can do some of this type of stuff. Now here's a case where you can see my unlit brush is paler than the darker brush here. Still a nice effect, so I'm going to go with it anyway. So far, so good. Eyes are going to be interesting. Now, normally you would think I would want to do this with the mirror, so it's the same eye as both sides. But building the eye perfectly the first time is tricky, and you can't do adjustments with the mirror tool. Mirror tool only mimics the paintbrush. So if I need to move something, it ain't going to fly. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to start by turning off the mirror and make my eyeball. My eyeball, because I'm stylized, I can be a little bit cartoony here. And now we go black. There we go. Pretty good eyeball. Now I can do things like adjust it, move it around, get it perfect, maybe add any more pieces I feel like adding to it. That's a pretty good eyeball right there. I'm actually going to grab those pieces and group them so Tilt Brush is going to consider it one piece. Now I'm going to put it in place. What looks good for my fish? Right about there, I think. That looks good. That looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do, getting a duplicate to line up is very, very difficult. So now that I've got it the place I want, now is when I get the mirror and add one or two details. For example, let's get that red and just do a couple brush strokes around it. I'm going to use this one. Now that that is mirrored, I know exactly where to put the eyeball. Now I can use my selection tool to grab the eye, duplicate it. Don't forget to flip it around. Same eye on the other side, looks a little weird. And now we'll move it over here. Whoops. Be careful you don't resize it or anything. Clumsy movement may accidentally resize the eye. So now we're just going to get it lined up the same way and close to the same place. Look at it from a couple different angles. That looks pretty good. Fish so far. Now what's nice is I can go through using the recolor tool. So if I wanted to try a fish that's a little more rainbow, I could indeed just go in and start recoloring scales, that type of thing. Come up with your own patterns, come up with your own colors. It's never written in stone. You can always go back and make adjustments. Whoops. I keep moving away from my fish. I was just trying to get rid of the blue and go back to what we had before. Okay. Back to my original goldfish. So anything that you need to prepare and you want to have on both sides, but it's something that needs adjustment, create the first one separately, put it in place, and then add the mirror to put marking points. So when you duplicate, you can use those marking points to line it up. I'm going to do that again with the gills in here. So I'm going to turn off the mirror. And I'm going to make gills. Let's see, I'm going to use that same slightly different color for the gills area. So we'll use a similar but slightly different orange. This one's a little more yellow. And then I'm going to use our disc of unlit. Disc. Anyone can do a disc, even Quest. Quest can't do a sphere, but Quest can do a disc. Just like a circle. Let's get him. How do I want it to look? Think about like that. So we'll need to get rid of some scales, but that's about how I want it to look. Sticking out a little bit. Bring it like that. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, let's get you out of the way again, so we can get rid of some of these extra scales. Oops. Watch your hand. You don't get rid of something you want to keep. There we go. Now then. Let's actually make it the same color orange. Same color orange. And then, oops. Okay. Now we're going to grab this. Whoops. Let's go offline here and reselect you. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a duplicate in a darker color to act as a shadow pair. So we're going to take him, duplicate him, switch to a slightly darker shade, and then recolor it. So now we can use it to make a shadow cast as this object behind it, as fish gills often are. So now I can group those together and position them in the same place. So now we've got that line, and you can see it creates that shadow line to make it a little more believable. I'm going to grab that group and duplicate it. Oops, I keep getting the extra fin there. So I can have a nice double pattern going here. Now that I've got that, I do want it to line up on the other side. So here's where I bring back the mirror tool. I'm going to use a brighter yellow, just because I never got to use that, and add some registration points. Where do they roughly line up? I'm later going to add more yellow, so that doesn't stand out as much. But now I can use that to see where I'm supposed to put the gills on the other side. You'll notice the eraser, even with the mirror tool up, the eraser didn't get rid of the scales on this side. Like I mentioned before, only the brush gets mirrored. So let's clear some of these guys out of the way. Oops, I keep hitting him too easily. There we go. Now we don't need the mirror anymore. We're going to grab our gills, but not the fin. Duplicate. As before, don't forget to flip. And we'll bring them over to this side. Keep it the same size. We're just trying to use those registration points. Remember, I'm not overlapping the eyeball. Compare a little bit. I'm even going to turn off that. Let's see. Fishy, fishy. That's pretty good. And it looks like they're a little more pronounced on that side. So let's undo. Fine tuning, I find getting bigger work, so a smaller movement will be a little more controlled. There we go. Nah, still too much overlapping the fin here. Let's see how that looks. That compared to that. Head on, that side's a little bulgier. Bulgier. Plus we can get rid of some of these once it's in the right place. That's looking pretty good. I think we just get rid of a couple of scales. No, even those scales are overlapping a little bit there. I'd say that's pretty good. I'd say that's pretty good. Now with the mirror back on, I'm going to go in with some of that yellow just to add a little more detailing to the face. So let's use our dropper tool to get that same tool. And go a little bit smaller to add some finer details here. Oh, that's the hull. I don't want the hull. I want an actual brush. But again, I'm going to keep it unlit. So these details aren't affected by shadow and light. I'm not going to cast shadows against the fish. It's just a little tricky to see where the fish is sometimes. So going back and forth, as long as you don't move anything, that mirror will keep a nice perfect symmetry going here. Okay, let's get a little more embellishments down here. There we go. There we go. Getting a little more interesting here. How about some whiskers? All right. Now for the mouth, I'm going to come around here. Now, keeping with the cartoon style, I think I'm going to use the toon brush. And what's nice with the toon brush, you'll notice it's got a pointy end and a thicker end. So I'm going to try to take advantage of that when doing the mouth here. Let's go for a darker color, but still fairly red. Now, if you don't get it the first time, feel free to undo and try again, because as everybody knows, fish lips is hard to draw. So here we go. That's not bad. That's not bad. Okay. Now, because I'm using color for light and shadow in most cases, I want to get a little more darker orange detail in here. So let's go for our dropper tool to get the shadow orange, but then go back to our marker tool to add detailing. I don't want to get too much into good detailing because I'm not going realistic. But you can see how it's all now starting to come together. Rather than these flat whiskers, let's get rid of those guys. Eraser tool doesn't get rid of both of them, even if you're mirrored. Now, let's add the spike tool. It's got more dimension to it, but still becomes a long, drawn-out spike. And let's make it a very different color. How big do you want the base of your spike? I'm going for it fairly narrow here. So you can see that it's got a little more weight to it, a little more thickness to it. In fact, I like that so much, I'm going to do that to these guys in the back as well. Eraser. Get rid of all 4 of those. So I can switch back to my green tool. Okay. Now you can spend as much time doing as much detail as you like. I'm just going to add a few more little embellishments to tie it in with the rest of the landscape. So for example, now's the time I may go in with the bubbles. I don't need the mirror for the bubbles. Now I'm going to go very small bubbles to start with. But then they're going to get a little bit bigger. Then a little bit bigger. And then a little bit bigger. And then a little bit bigger. Oops. There we go. All right. Now, if this was the only part of the picture, I could do a select all to grab the whole fish and duplicate it, to make a whole school, as it were, of fish. In this case, I'm just going to make the fish very, very small. So not far away, small. And now I'm going to use my selection tool. Here's a case where Quest users may get bogged down depending on how complicated you made your fish. Because now I can duplicate. 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 If you're using a powerful computer, there should be no problem. If you're using just a Quest on its own, then it's starting to get a little bit under pressure here. How many you do is up to you. That's a little too big, I guess. I already got one giant one in the background. Let's put another one in the foreground over here. Fish. School of fish. So that's just an example of using these tools, using these tricks to make an object, to make a thing. This time it's a fish. We've done cities and forests. If there's things you'd like to see us do, let us know in the comments. We don't mind doing custom videos based on questions or based on suggestions. But this one was merely bringing it all together, making one solid final piece. From here, you could just take it and go crazy. This was just a starting point because we, alas, don't have infinite amount of time here on Teaching Tilt Brush. So let us know what you'd like to see. Thanks for joining us. We do this all the time. That's kind of hard to read against the background. Let's use a vibrant color. There we go. We do this all the time on youtube.com/shamelessmayhem. We also do other programs, for example, Sculptor VR. We're starting a series on Gravity Sketch and all sorts of fun stuff like that. Let us know what you'd like to see. Have fun with Tilt Brush.